A shadow longer than 2 football fields once moved across American and European cities in complete silence, taking a full minute to pass overhead. No engine roar, no vibration. Tonight traces the forgotten age when humans crossed oceans by floating. Before we continue, just wanted to let you know that we have heard your feedback and we're now on Spotify. Go through the link in the description to join us there for a rich listening experience. For roughly 3 decades, from the turn of the 20th century until 1937, the largest flying machines ever built were not airplanes. They were rigid airships, enormous cigar-shaped vessels, held aloft not by speed or wings, but by buoyancy, the same simple principle that lifts a balloon. The largest of them, the Hindenburg, measured 804 feet from nose to tail. To put that scale into something graspable, it was longer than 2.5 American football fields placed end to end, longer than the Titanic, longer than almost any structure that had ever moved through open air under its own power. These machines did something that nothing else at the time could match. An ocean liner crossing the Atlantic in the 1920s took roughly 5 days. A rigid airship could make the same crossing in 2 to 3 days, cutting the journey nearly in half, while offering passengers an experience that no ship, and certainly no airplane of that era, could provide. There was no engine vibration to speak of, no rolling motion from waves, no cramped cabin pressed against dozens of others. Passengers walked through panoramic windows that ran the length of a lounge, watching the curvature of the ocean pass beneath them at an altitude low enough to see whales, ships, and the wakes of fishing boats, yet high enough that the world below felt like a map come to life. For people who lived through this era, an airship passing overhead was an event. Crowds gathered in the streets. Children ran beneath the slow-moving shadow, necks craned upward, trying to keep pace with something that dwarfed every building they could see. Newspapers ran the route and schedule of major crossings in advance, the way television networks would later announce a rocket launch, and people would plan to be outside, in a field, or on a rooftop, simply to watch one of these machines pass overhead for the brief minute or 2 it took to cross their line of sight. One man who watched the American airship Macon cross over his town as a boy later described it as looking like an enormous silver whale suspended in the sky, the rumble of its engines carrying like a line of distant locomotives, and the memory of running after it down the sidewalk staying with him for the rest of his life. The interiors of the largest passenger airships were unlike anything available in the air before or since. Passengers had private double cabins, not seats. They ate meals prepared fresh in an onboard galley, served in a proper dining room with table linens and a wine list. Some ships carried a specially built lightweight piano in their lounge. None of this was an accident or an indulgence. The people designing these machines understood that they were selling an experience as much as a mode of transport, an entirely new and unhurried way of seeing the world from above, one that no airplane of the era, cramped and loud and built for speed rather than comfort, could begin to offer its passengers. And then, within the span of a few catastrophic years in the 1930s, the entire technology collapsed. Disasters claimed ship after ship. Public confidence, built carefully over 3 decades, evaporated in a series of fires and crashes that made newspaper front pages around the world. By 1938, the company that had pioneered the rigid airship had stopped building them entirely. The skies that had once carried these silent giants across oceans went quiet. And for most of the rest of the 20th century, the rigid airship simply ceased to exist as a working technology. What is easy to forget, looking back from a world where these machines vanished so completely, is how genuinely remarkable they were while they lasted. They were not failed experiments stumbling toward something better. For a real and measurable period of history, they were the fastest, most comfortable, and most awe-inspiring way to cross an ocean that human beings had ever built. They carried passengers in private cabins with proper beds. They served meals cooked fresh in onboard kitchens. They circled the entire globe, They launched and recovered fighter aircraft mid-flight from hangars built into their own bellies, a feat that sounds more like science fiction than 1930s engineering. And yet it happened, repeatedly, and it worked. Tonight is the story of how that happened. It begins with a question that sounds almost too simple to need an answer. How does something this large, carrying dozens of people and tons of cargo, stay in the sky at all, without the wings or the engine-driven lift that every airplane depends on? The answer is older than the airplane itself, simpler than you might expect, and it is where this story has to begin. If tonight finds you settling in for a long, calm rest, you are in good company. There are 19 more chapters ahead, each one slower and quieter than the last, tracing this forgotten age all the way from a steam-powered balloon in 1852 to a single quiet airship flying over San Francisco just last year. We will be here for all of it. The question of how something the length of 2 football fields could hang motionless in open sky, carrying dozens of people and tons of cargo, has a surprisingly simple answer, and it has nothing to do with the engines. An airship belongs to a category of aircraft called aerostats, a word built from the Greek roots for air and standing still. The principle behind it is the same one that explains why a cork floats on water and a heavy stone does not. It is called buoyancy, and it was described mathematically more than 2,000 years ago by Archimedes, who worked out that an object immersed in a fluid experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. A boat floats because the volume of water it pushes aside weighs more than the boat itself. An airship floats in air for exactly the same reason, except the fluid being displaced is the atmosphere, and the thing doing the displacing is a vast envelope filled with gas that weighs less than the air around it. This is the detail that separates an airship from an airplane in a way that matters more than almost anything else in this entire story. An airplane is a heavier-than-air craft. Its wings generate lift only because the engines are pushing it forward fast enough for air to flow over the wing surface in a way that creates an upward force. Cut the engines on an airplane in level flight, and it begins to fall, trading altitude for forward speed until it can glide to a landing or it cannot. An airship works on an entirely different principle. Its lift comes from the buoyant gas inside its envelope, not from its engines, and not from forward motion. Cut the engines on an airship, and it does not fall. It simply stops moving forward, suspended exactly where it was, by the same buoyant force that was holding it up a moment before. This is, in the truest and most literal sense, what allowed these vessels to cross oceans without depending on their engines to stay airborne. The engines on a rigid airship existed to push the vessel through the air and to allow it to be steered, exactly the way a ship's engine pushes a vessel through water rather than holding it up out of the water in the first place. The water was already doing that job. In an airship, the lifting gas was doing it. 2 gases dominated the history of airship design, and the choice between them shaped almost everything that happened in the decades that followed. Hydrogen, the lightest element in existence, was abundant, cheap to produce, and provided tremendous lift. It was also extremely flammable, capable of igniting from the smallest spark and burning with terrifying speed. Helium, by contrast, is chemically inert. It cannot burn under any ordinary circumstance. But helium is also far rarer in nature than hydrogen, and for much of the 20th century, significant deposits of it existed in commercially extractable quantities almost nowhere except the United States, which meant that any nation without access to American helium exports was left choosing between safety it could not obtain and danger it could. Rigid airships, the category this story focuses on, added one more layer of engineering on top of the basic buoyancy principle. Rather than relying on the gas pressure alone to hold their shape, the way a simple balloon or a modern advertising blimp does, rigid airships were built around an internal structural skeleton, usually constructed from a lightweight aluminum alloy, arranged in a series of rings and longitudinal beams running the length of the vessel. Inside that skeleton, separate gas-filled cells, sometimes a dozen or more, held the actual lifting gas, each cell independent of the others, so that damage to one would not necessarily doom the entire ship. A fabric skin stretched over the outside of this framework, smoothing the airflow and protecting the structure from weather, but carrying almost none of the actual structural load itself. The frame did the holding, the skin did the smoothing, and the gas inside did the lifting. This combination, a rigid metal skeleton wrapped around buoyant gas cells, is what allowed engineers to build airships at a scale that no simple pressure-held balloon could ever match. And it is the design that produced every one of the great vessels this story is about to follow. The man who first wrote this idea down in any serious form did so not in an engineering office, but in his own private diary, in 1874, decades before anyone would build a ship large enough to prove that his idea actually worked. His name was Ferdinand von Zeppelin, and the story of how his idea became real is where this journey properly begins. Before Zeppelin, before the giants, before any vessel large enough to be called a sky giant in any meaningful sense, a handful of inventors spent half a century proving that the basic idea could be made to work at all. The first genuinely controlled, powered flight of an airship took place in 1852, when a French engineer named Henri Giffard built a cigar-shaped envelope filled with hydrogen and suspended a small steam engine beneath it, producing roughly 3 horsepower, a figure that sounds almost comically modest, set against the engines that would eventually power the giants of the 1930s. Giffard's airship flew, and it flew under its own power, in a direction the pilot chose rather than wherever the wind happened to push it. That distinction, control rather than mere floating, is what separates an airship from a simple balloon, and Giffard's 1852 flight is generally credited as the first time a human being achieved it. The engine was the limiting factor for decades afterward. Steam engines powerful enough to be useful were too heavy to lift along with their own fuel and water supply, and the underpowered engines that were light enough to carry produced barely enough thrust to make meaningful headway against any wind at all. Giffard's 3 horsepower could not have pushed his airship against anything stronger than a gentle breeze. The next major leap came in 1884, when 2 French engineers, Charles Renard and Arthur Krebs, built an airship named La France, powered not by steam but by an electric motor drawing from an onboard battery. La France achieved something Giffard's craft never had: a fully controlled round trip. The airship traveled nearly 5 miles from its starting point, turned, and flew back, landing at the exact location it had departed from. The first time in the history of flight that anyone had demonstrated this level of command over an aircraft's path. Newspapers across Europe covered the achievement, and it effectively silenced the lingering skepticism that powered, controllable flight in a lighter-than-air craft was even possible at meaningful scale. What both Giffard's craft and La France had in common, beyond their modest size, was a design approach that engineers now call non-rigid. There was no internal skeleton. The envelope held its cigar shape purely through the pressure of the gas inside it, the same way a balloon animal holds its shape only as long as it remains inflated. This approach worked reasonably well at the scale these early pioneers were building at, but it carried an inherent ceiling. As an envelope grows larger, the forces acting on it during flight, particularly bending and twisting forces along its length, grow much faster than the gas pressure alone can resist. Build a non-rigid airship too large, and it will sag, buckle, or simply fail to hold its intended shape under the stress of normal flight. This was the central problem facing anyone who wanted to build something genuinely large. The engines of the 1880s and 1890s were steadily improving, growing lighter and more powerful as internal combustion technology developed, removing one obstacle to scale. But the structural problem, how to keep an enormous envelope from collapsing on itself, remained unsolved. Several engineers across Europe were independently circling the same idea as a potential answer. Build an internal frame, a skeleton strong enough to hold the shape of the vessel regardless of gas pressure, and let the gas cells inside that frame handle the lifting without also being asked to handle the structural integrity of the entire craft. A Frenchman named Joseph Spiess patented a rigid airship design along these lines in 1873, a year before Ferdinand von Zeppelin even began writing about the concept in his diary. But Spiess could never secure the funding to build a working prototype. A Russian rocket theorist named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was independently developing detailed designs for a metal-clad airship around the same period. Designs sophisticated enough that some elements anticipated structural solutions that would not be built for decades. The idea, in other words, was genuinely in the air, pursued by multiple inventors across multiple countries at roughly the same time, the way significant technological breakthroughs often are. What none of these earlier visionaries had was the combination of engineering resources, sustained funding, and sheer persistence required to take the idea from a patent drawing to an actual working vessel large enough to matter. That combination belonged to one man, and he had already been carrying the idea in a private diary for over 20 years by the time he finally got the chance to prove it could fly. He was not an engineer by training, and he did not invent the rigid airship concept from nothing. What he brought to the idea that Giffard, Renard, Krebs, Spiess, and Tsiolkovsky had each touched in their own way was something none of them had managed to assemble together. A position of social standing that could attract serious investors, a stubbornness that refused to accept early failure as final, and several decades of patient persistence in a field that for most of his working life treated him as an eccentric nobleman chasing an impractical dream. In 1863, a young German military officer named Ferdinand von Zeppelin traveled to the United States as an official observer attached to the Union Army during the American Civil War. While there, he encountered something that would lodge itself in his mind for the rest of his life: military observation balloons, tethered above battlefields, providing a vantage point no soldier on the ground could match. It was his first close encounter with lighter-than-air flight, and though he would not act on it for another decade, the seed had been planted. That seed grew on March 25, 1874, when Zeppelin attended a lecture on world postal services and air travel given by a man named Heinrich von Stefan. Something in that lecture crystallized the idea he had been carrying since his American trip into something specific and describable. That same night, he wrote in his private diary an outline of a concept, a large, rigidly framed outer envelope containing several separate gas bags inside it, capable of carrying meaningful cargo or passengers across real distances rather than simply floating wherever the wind decided to take it. It was, in its essential shape, a description of the machine that would eventually bear his name, written down 16 years before he would resign his military commission to pursue it seriously, and 26 years before he would actually build one. Zeppelin spent those intervening decades as a career military officer, rising eventually to the rank of general, while the idea sat largely dormant beyond occasional notes and conversations. He formally outlined the concept in greater technical detail by 1893 and secured a German patent for the design in 1895, followed by a United States patent in 1899. By this point, Zeppelin was in his late 50s, a retired general with a title, a modest fortune, and an idea that most of the engineering establishment in Germany regarded as the harmless obsession of an aging aristocrat with too much time and not enough technical grounding. He pressed forward anyway, working with engineers he recruited and funded largely through his own resources and a syndicate of private investors he convinced to back the project. Zeppelin built his first airship on the shores of Lake Constance in southern Germany, near the Swiss border. It was constructed in a floating hangar that could be rotated to keep the airship aligned with the wind during launch. an engineering detail that itself reflected serious thought about the practical challenges of operating something this large and unwieldy. On the evening of July 2, 1900, that airship, designated LZ-1, made its first flight. 12,000 spectators gathered along the shores of Lake Constance to watch, a remarkable turnout for a contraption that, as far as most of them knew, had no proven track record of working at all. The LZ-1 measured 420 feet in length and 38 feet in diameter, making it, at that moment, the largest thing ever built that was capable of flight. Zeppelin himself was at the controls. The airship was towed out of its floating hangar by a steam launch, and once clear, it rose into the evening sky carrying 5 people aboard, climbing to an altitude of approximately 1,300 feet and covering a distance of roughly 3.5 miles. It was not a flawless debut. After 18 minutes in the air, engine trouble combined with a bent section of the frame forced Zeppelin to bring the airship back down and return it to its hangar earlier than planned. The flight had been short, imperfect, and far from the long-distance demonstration Zeppelin had hoped to provide his skeptical investors. But it had flown. The rigid internal skeleton had held its shape exactly as the diary entry from 26 years earlier had imagined it would, and the gas bags inside that skeleton had lifted 5 people and an aging count off the surface of a lake and carried them, under their own control, for 3.5 miles. The age of the rigid airship, the actual machines rather than the patents and diary entries describing them, had formally begun. Zeppelin's name would become so closely associated with what followed that within a generation, the word Zeppelin would be used as a casual synonym for any large, rigid airship at all, regardless of which company had actually built it, a kind of linguistic immortality that very few inventors ever achieve in their own lifetime. What came next moved faster than even Zeppelin himself might have predicted. Within a single decade of that imperfect 18-minute flight over Lake Constance, the rigid airship would go from a single experimental prototype, barely under control and prone to bent frames and engine failures, to a fleet of working vessels carrying paying passengers on a regular published schedule, years before any airplane in the world could make a comparable claim. The transformation from skeptical curiosity to commercial reality happened in Germany, and it happened faster than the history of almost any other transportation technology before or since. Most people, asked to name the first commercial airline in history, would guess something involving an airplane, probably something from the 1920s or later, once aircraft had grown reliable enough to carry passengers on a regular schedule. The actual answer predates that by more than a decade, and it involves no airplane at all. In 1909, a company called the Deutsche Luftschifffahrts Aktiengesellschaft was founded in Germany, a name that translates roughly to German Airship Travel Corporation, and which is generally shortened to its initials, DELAG. It is recognized today as the world's first airline, the first company anywhere on Earth organized specifically to carry fare-paying passengers through the air on a scheduled, repeated basis. It operated rigid airships built by Zeppelin's company, and it began commercial flights in 1910, a full 17 years before Charles Lindbergh's solo transatlantic flight, and well over a decade before any airplane manufacturer in the world had developed an aircraft remotely capable of comparable passenger service. The first explicitly civilian Zeppelin, distinct from the experimental and military vessels that had preceded it, was the LZ-5, completed in 1909, around the same time DELAG was being established. DELAG's early operations were confined to routes within Germany, connecting cities like Frankfurt, Düsseldorf, and Baden-Baden, since the technology of the era, while impressive, was not yet capable of safely and reliably crossing oceans with passengers aboard. The flights were leisurely by any modern standard, more akin to a scenic cruise than a point-to-point transportation service, but they were real, they were scheduled, and people paid real money to be aboard them. By the middle of 1914, in the years immediately before the outbreak of the First World War would interrupt civilian airship operations entirely, Delag had carried more than 34,000 passengers across over 1,500 individual flights. No fatal accident occurred during any of these early commercial passenger operations, a safety record that becomes more remarkable considering how new and untested the underlying technology still was. Passengers boarding a Delag airship in 1912 or 1913 were participating in something that had no real precedent anywhere in the world: organized, repeatable, commercially available human flight. The fleet Delag operated grew steadily across these 5 years, with several different vessels rotating through service as the company refined its routes and its understanding of which German cities offered the most reliable demand. Ticket prices placed the experience firmly within reach of the comfortable middle class and above, rather than the exclusive province of the aristocracy alone, and the company worked deliberately to build a reputation for safety and reliability that would distinguish its passenger service from the more experimental and occasionally dangerous early years of pure airship development. Photographs from the period show passengers dressed for what was clearly considered a special occasion: the men in suits and the women in their finest travel clothing, treating a Delag flight as an event worth documenting and remembering rather than a routine errand. What these early passengers experienced was unlike anything available to them through any other means of travel. The airships moved slowly by later standards, but the experience of gliding silently above the German countryside, watching towns and rivers and forests pass beneath an enclosed, comfortable cabin, was something genuinely new in human history. No previous generation had been able to observe their own landscape from this particular vantage point, slow enough to actually take in detail, high enough to see the shape of the land the way a map renders it, and comfortable enough to do so while seated, conversing, and looking out through actual windows rather than clinging to the open basket of a balloon. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 abruptly ended this first chapter of civilian airship travel. The German military requisitioned the airship fleet and the engineering expertise behind it for wartime purposes almost immediately, redirecting an industry that had been quietly proving the commercial viability of passenger air travel toward an entirely different and far darker application. Delag's pioneering commercial service, the genuine first airline in the history of the world, was suspended indefinitely, its considerable achievement largely overshadowed in public memory by what the same technology would soon be used for instead. It would be more than a decade before passenger airship service of comparable ambition would resume, and when it did, it would not be confined to short hops between German cities. It would cross oceans. But the war that interrupted Delag's quiet, peaceful service also accelerated the underlying engineering at a pace that peacetime development never could have matched, and the airships that emerged from that conflict were larger, faster, and considerably more capable than anything Delag had flown before 1914. That wartime chapter is brief, and it is not a comfortable one, but it cannot be skipped if the rest of this story is to make sense. When World War I began in August 1914, the German military took the same rigid airship technology that Delag had spent 5 peaceful years proving could safely carry passengers across the German countryside, and turned it toward an entirely different purpose. Starting in 1915, German Zeppelins began conducting bombing raids against British targets, including London. This was, in a meaningful historical sense, the first sustained strategic bombing campaign in the history of warfare directed against a civilian population from the air. No prior conflict had featured this particular combination: large, slow-moving aircraft capable of carrying meaningful bomb loads across the English Channel, flying at night to reduce the risk of detection and interception, dropping ordnance on cities that had never before needed to consider the sky itself as a source of danger. The psychological effect on the British public was significant, introducing an entirely new category of wartime anxiety that no previous generation had needed to carry. The airships used for these raids flew at considerable altitude to stay above the range of contemporary anti-aircraft guns, and the relatively primitive fighter aircraft Britain could field against them in the early years of the war. This altitude advantage came at a real cost. As an airship climbs, the atmospheric pressure around it decreases, and the hydrogen inside its gas cells expands to fill the additional available space. Crews had to vent gas deliberately to prevent the cells from rupturing under that expansion, and every cubic foot of hydrogen vented in this way meant a corresponding and permanent loss of lift. This trade-off produced one of the more remarkable and least known episodes of the entire war. In 1917, an airship designated the L-55, commanded by Hans Kurt Fleming, was returning from what became known as the Silent Raid, an attack on London conducted at such extreme altitude that British defences below could neither see nor hear the airship passing overhead. To escape pursuing aircraft and anti-aircraft fire during the raid, Fleming forced his ship to climb to approximately 24,000 feet, setting an altitude record for a rigid airship that would stand for the remainder of the war and beyond. The achievement came at a steep price. The gas vented during that extreme climb left the L-55 dangerously short on lift. As the airship attempted to descend back to a normal operating altitude over German territory, the loss of buoyancy proved unrecoverable, and the ship crashed. This pattern, extraordinary technical achievement, purchased at a cost the underlying physics made nearly impossible to avoid, characterized much of the wartime airship program. The vessels could fly higher and faster than anything that had come before them, but every gain in altitude or speed extracted a corresponding toll in fuel, lifting gas, or structural stress that made the margin for error increasingly thin. Britain's response to the Zeppelin threat extended beyond simply developing better fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft defences, though it did that as well. The Royal Navy, alarmed by the demonstrated reach and capability of German airships, began developing its own fleet, including a specific class of smaller, non-rigid airships purpose-built for detecting German submarines operating in coastal waters around the British Isles, a role for which their slow speed and extended endurance over open water made them genuinely well-suited, in marked contrast to their limitations as bombers. By the war's end in 1918, the rigid airship had been pushed through several years of intensive wartime development that no peacetime commercial program could have funded or justified on its own. Engines grew more powerful. Structural designs grew more sophisticated, incorporating lessons learned from combat losses and near misses that peacetime testing alone would never have revealed. The vessels that emerged from the war were faster, larger, and more capable than Delag's pre-war passenger fleet had ever been. But the technology now carried something it had not carried in 1914, a public association with danger from the sky, an early taste of what airships were capable of doing to a city below them, that the post-war passenger era would have to work hard to overcome. The wartime raids also left behind a quieter and more technical legacy. The engineers who had spent 4 years solving the practical problems of high-altitude flight, gas management under combat pressure, and structural reinforcement against the stresses of evasive maneuvering carried that hard-won knowledge directly into the post-war commercial designs. The same lessons that came from watching the L-55 fall out of the sky over Germany would, within a decade, help make a very different kind of airship safe enough to carry paying passengers across the Atlantic Ocean for the very first time. The transition from wartime weapon back to peacetime passenger vessel was neither immediate nor guaranteed. Germany's defeat in 1918 brought with it severe restrictions on military aviation under the terms that would eventually be formalized in the Treaty of Versailles, restrictions that very nearly ended the rigid airship program in Germany altogether before it had the chance to enter what would become its true golden age. The first airship to cross the Atlantic Ocean was not built by Germany at all. It was British, and the secret of its origin was, for years, deliberately kept from the public. R-34 was constructed by William Beardmore and Company at their facility in Inchinnan, near Glasgow, and her crew affectionately nicknamed her Tiny, a joke given that she measured 643 feet in length. What wartime censorship concealed at the time, and what historical research has since confirmed beyond dispute, is that R-34 was not an original British design at all. She was a close copy of a German Zeppelin, the LZ-33, which had made a forced landing in Essex, England, in September 1916, after sustaining damage during a raid. British engineers studied the captured vessel in detail and used what they learned to build their own version, a fact that remained officially unacknowledged for years after the war. In July 1919, less than 3 weeks after British aviators John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown completed the first non-stop transatlantic flight by airplane, R-34 set out to do something even more ambitious: cross the Atlantic by air and return, the first round-trip aerial crossing in history. She departed East Fortune, Scotland, at 1:42 in the morning on July 2, 1919, carrying a complement of 30, including a stowaway who had not been part of the official roster. That stowaway was a Newcastle man named William Ballantyne, who had originally been assigned to the ground crew and had no authorization to be aboard, along with an unauthorized feline passenger, a kitten the crew named Wopsy. Neither was discovered until the airship was already well out over open ocean, far too late to turn back. Ballantyne and Wopsy completed the entire crossing as unplanned additions to the official passenger manifest, becoming, in the process, among the first stowaways in the history of transatlantic aviation, human and otherwise. R-34 had never been designed with long passenger comfort in mind. She was built for military reconnaissance and patrol, not extended transoceanic voyages, and her crew compartments reflected that. Sleeping arrangements consisted of hammocks slung along the keel walkway running the length of the ship's interior, supplemented during the crossing by makeshift tables and wash basins, with lightweight curtains rigged up to cut down on the considerable drafts that found their way through the structure. The flight itself tested both the airship and her crew. Fuel supplies dwindled steadily across the long crossing, and the ship encountered violent squalls along the way that pushed both the vessel and the men flying her close to their limits. At one point, a leak developed in one of the gas cells, and the crew, lacking any proper repair materials at hand, patched it using the entirety of their remaining supply of chewing gum, a detail that survives in the historical record precisely because it captures the genuinely improvised, seat-of-the-pants character of early long-distance aviation. R-34 reached Mineola on Long Island, New York, at 9:54 in the morning on July 6, 1919, a flight of 108 hours and 12 minutes after departing Scotland, arriving with only a few gallons of fuel remaining in her tanks. The American ground crew waiting to receive her had no prior experience handling a rigid airship of this size, and rather than risk a poor landing in inexperienced hands, an officer named Major E.M. Pritchard parachuted down from R-34 himself to direct the ground operation from below, becoming, in the process, the first person in history to reach American soil by air having departed from Europe. One crew member, reflecting on the experience of the crossing itself, wrote words that capture something genuinely rare about early airship travel. "We feel in a world of our own, up here, amidst this dazzling array of snow-white clouds. No words can express the wonder, the grandeur, or the loneliness of it all. It is a sentiment that no passenger crossing the Atlantic by ocean liner, confined to the deck and the railings, could ever have written in quite the same way." R-34's achievement made front-page headlines across both Britain and the United States, and inspired a wave of commemorative souvenir postcards celebrating the crossing. The return flight to Fulham, England, completed between July 10 and 13, 1919, took just 75 hours, considerably faster than the outbound journey, thanks to more favorable winds blowing from west to east. Together, The two crossings made R-34 the first aircraft of any kind to complete a full round trip across the Atlantic Ocean by air. What the flight proved beyond the simple fact of distance covered was something the rest of this story would spend the next 2 decades expanding upon at far greater scale and considerably more comfort. That an airship, properly built and properly flown, could cross an ocean that ships had taken 5 days to manage, and could do it while carrying passengers and crew through conditions no previous form of travel had ever exposed a human being to. 5 years after R-34's pioneering crossing, an airship built by the very company that had inspired her secret design made its own journey across the Atlantic, this time under entirely legitimate and openly acknowledged circumstances. The terms that ended World War I placed severe restrictions on German military aviation, and rigid airships, having been used as bombers throughout the conflict, fell under particular scrutiny. For several years after 1918, the future of Zeppelin's company in Germany looked genuinely uncertain. Yet within the terms of the post-war settlement lay an unusual and oddly fortunate provision for the company's survival. Germany owed war reparations to the United States, and rather than settling that particular debt purely in cash, diplomatic negotiations arrived at an alternative. Germany would build a new Zeppelin and deliver it directly to the United States Navy. The result was LZ-126, constructed at the Zeppelin Works in Friedrichshafen specifically for this purpose. The construction itself was watched closely on both sides of the Atlantic, since the vessel represented something genuinely unusual in the history of international relations. A former enemy nation building one of the most sophisticated flying machines in the world and handing it over, intact and fully functional, to the military of the nation it had so recently been at war with. American naval observers were present during portions of the construction process, and the entire project carried a weight of diplomatic significance well beyond its engineering specifications. In October 1924, the airship made the transatlantic delivery flight to the United States, commanded personally by Hugo Eckener, the company's chairman, and the man who had effectively inherited leadership of Zeppelin's enterprise following the Count's death in 1917. Eckener understood precisely what was at stake in this flight. It was not merely a debt being settled. It was an opportunity to demonstrate to an American public and an American government that held considerable sway over the future of airship technology through their control of the world's helium supply, that German engineering remained the gold standard in this field even after the disruption and restriction of the war years. The flight succeeded without major incident, and upon arrival, LZ-126 was formally commissioned into the United States Navy as USS Los Angeles, carrying the designation ZR-3. What followed was, by any measure, a genuine success story. USS Los Angeles went on to become the most reliable and successful American airship of the entire interwar period, operating without serious incident for 8 consecutive years before being retired in 1932 purely for economic reasons rather than any failure of the vessel itself. She was eventually dismantled in 1940, having outlived nearly every other rigid airship constructed during the same era, American or otherwise, without ever suffering the kind of catastrophic accident that would claim so many of her contemporaries. The significance of this single delivery flight extended well beyond the airship itself. It re-established, in the clearest possible terms, that Zeppelin's engineering tradition had survived the war intact and remained capable of building vessels that worked exactly as intended across genuinely difficult conditions. For Hugo Eckener personally, the successful delivery of LZ-126 provided crucial momentum and credibility at a moment when his company desperately needed both. Acquiring the funding and the official permission necessary to build the next generation of German passenger airships would require exactly this kind of demonstrated reliability and exactly this kind of renewed international goodwill. Eckener was, by most accounts from those who worked alongside him, a man who understood public relations every bit as well as he understood engineering. and he used the success of the Los Angeles delivery as a foundation for everything that followed, citing it repeatedly in his fundraising appeals to skeptical German investors and government officials over the following years. It would still take Eckener several more years of persistent lobbying, public relations work, and fundraising before that next great airship could actually be built. Restrictions on German airship construction were not meaningfully relaxed until 1926, and even after that loosening, the difficult economic conditions of post-war Germany made raising sufficient capital for an ambitious new project genuinely challenging. Eckener spent roughly 2 years pursuing the funding and approvals necessary, a campaign that combined private fundraising appeals to the German public with sustained efforts to secure government backing. That persistence eventually paid off. On September 18, 1928, a new airship, designated LZ-127, made her first flight. Eckener named her in honor of the man whose diary entry, written 54 years earlier, had started this entire story. She would go on to circle the entire planet, a feat that no ocean liner, no train, and no airplane of that era could have matched, and a feat that would make her, very quickly, the single most famous flying machine anywhere in the world. LZ-127, christened Graf Zeppelin, in honor of the Count whose 1874 diary entry had started this entire story, took her first flight on September 18, 1928. She had been funded through a combination of public subscription, with ordinary German citizens contributing roughly 2.5 million Reichsmarks toward her construction, and direct support from the German government, a genuine national project in a way few aircraft before or since have ever been. Graf Zeppelin's early career established her as the first vessel in history to offer commercial transatlantic passenger flight service on anything resembling a regular basis, crossing between Germany and destinations in North and South America in a fraction of the time any ocean liner could manage. But the achievement that would cement her place in aviation history came in 1929, when she set out to do something no aircraft of any kind had ever attempted: fly all the way around the world. The expedition was funded in significant part by William Randolph Hearst's media empire, which covered roughly half the considerable expense involved in exchange for exclusive press rights to the story as it unfolded. The flight departed from Lakehurst, New Jersey, with major stops planned at Friedrichshafen in Germany, Tokyo in Japan, and Los Angeles, California, before returning to the starting point. In total, the journey covered approximately 19,500 miles, an almost unimaginable distance for any aircraft to travel in a single continuous expedition in 1929, accomplished using an airship whose lift came from buoyant gas, rather than the brute force engine power an equivalent airplane journey would have required. Among the more unusual details of this historic flight was an unexpected passenger, an eastern gorilla named Susie, captured near Lake Kivu in the Belgian Congo and sold by her original German owner to an American animal dealer, traveled aboard Graf Zeppelin during portions of the journey. After touring the United States, Susie eventually found a permanent home at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1931, where she lived until her death in 1947, an oddly specific footnote to one of the most ambitious aviation achievements of the entire era. The circumnavigation made Graf Zeppelin and her crew international celebrities, and it cemented Hugo Eckener's reputation as the preeminent figure in commercial airship operations anywhere in the world. The flight also produced the first non-stop crossing of the Pacific Ocean by any aircraft, a record that stood as a remarkable technical achievement entirely separate from the broader circumnavigation it was part of. Over the remainder of her operational life, Graf Zeppelin would go on to fly 590 individual flights, accumulating nearly 1.7 million kilometers of total distance, the equivalent of more than 40 trips around the equator. She made repeated transatlantic crossings to both New York and Rio de Janeiro, established a regular Germany to South America passenger route that operated reliably for years, and even ventured into Arctic territory on a scientific research expedition, demonstrating a versatility that no other aircraft of her era, lighter than air or otherwise, could begin to match. What made all of this possible was not simply scale, though Graf Zeppelin was, at the time of her construction, the longest and largest airship yet built. It was also a specially formulated fuel called blau gas, burned by her engines for propulsion. Unlike conventional aviation fuel, which grows steadily lighter as it is consumed during a flight, gradually making an aircraft lighter and requiring constant adjustment to maintain proper buoyancy, blau gas was formulated to weigh almost exactly the same as the surrounding air. Burning it for fuel had only a minimal effect on the airship's overall buoyancy, allowing for far more stable, predictable long-range flight than conventional liquid fuel would have permitted. On a typical transatlantic crossing, Graf Zeppelin relied on blau gas for roughly 90% of her fuel needs, switching to conventional petrol only when the ship had grown too heavy and needed the extra weight reduction that burning liquid fuel provided. It was an elegant, almost poetic engineering solution to a problem unique to lighter-than-air flight, and it captures something essential about the entire era this story is tracing: extraordinary cleverness applied to genuinely difficult physical problems in service of an achievement that, for a few remarkable years, nothing else on Earth could match. The ship typically carried 3,500 kilograms of ballast water and a further 650 kilograms of spare parts, including a complete extra propeller, on every transatlantic crossing, a reflection of how seriously her crew took the reality of operating thousands of miles from the nearest repair facility over open ocean. Calcium chloride was mixed into that ballast water specifically to prevent it from freezing at altitude, and even the grey water drained from the ship's sinks was retained rather than discarded, repurposed as additional ballast that could be shifted forward or aft to help maintain the airship's trim during flight. Not every crossing went as smoothly as the history books tend to remember. On October 13, 1929, during one of her transatlantic crossings, Graf Zeppelin encountered a line of squalls severe enough to test every assumption her crew had developed about the limits of safe operation. The trouble began with a piloting error rather than the weather itself. An elevator man, the crew member responsible for controlling the airship's pitch, lacked the experience to handle the violent turbulence the storm was generating, and his inputs caused the great ship to pitch more sharply than her structure had been designed to tolerate under normal operating conditions. The strain proved too much for one section of the vessel. The fabric covering over the lower portion of the ship's port fin tore away, exposing the internal framework beneath to the full force of the storm and threatening the structural integrity of the entire tail assembly. This was, in the most literal sense, an emergency. The fins of a rigid airship are not a cosmetic feature. They provide the aerodynamic stability that keeps a vessel of this size flying in a controlled, predictable manner. And serious damage to one risked making the entire ship difficult or impossible to control through the remainder of the storm. Captain Hugo Eckener, known throughout his career for a generally cautious approach to dangerous weather, made an unusual decision in this particular moment. Rather than attempting to reduce power and ride out the storm passively, he chose to maintain substantial engine power, navigating the airship through the worst of the turbulence with deliberate, controlled inputs rather than simply hoping the ship would survive on its own. Eckener and his officers gradually regained stability as the worst of the squall line passed, but the damage to the fin remained, and it could not simply be left as it was for the remainder of a multi-day ocean crossing with no opportunity to land and make repairs at any conventional facility. What followed was one of the more remarkable feats of in-flight engineering in the entire history of airship operations. Eckener organized a specialized repair team and sent them out, while the airship continued flying onto the exterior structure of the damaged fin itself, working against the wind and the considerable height above the ocean below to stitch and reinforce the torn fabric, covering well enough to restore the fin's aerodynamic function. Among the men who carried out this repair was Eckener's own son, Knut Eckener, working alongside Albert Samt, an experienced elevator man who would later go on to a distinguished career commanding Zeppelin's airships himself, and Ludwig Knorr, who would go on to serve as the chief rigger on the construction of LZ-129, the airship that would eventually become known to the entire world as the Hindenburg. The team completed the repair successfully, restoring the fin to functional condition, while the ship remained in continuous flight, thousands of feet above open ocean, with no possibility of immediate rescue had anything gone wrong during the repair itself. Graf Zeppelin completed the crossing safely, landing after a total flight time of 111 hours and 44 minutes, which set a new record at the time for the longest non-stop flight of any kind, a remarkable achievement made considerably more impressive given the mid-flight emergency the crew had been forced to manage along the way. The damaged fin had reduced the ship's available power and forced a slower than intended approach for much of the remaining journey, and the reduced output from the ship's wind-driven generator, itself affected by the damage, meant Graf Zeppelin was unable to respond to repeated radio calls from ground stations asking for her position and estimated arrival time, causing genuine concern among those monitoring her progress from the ground before she finally arrived safely. The episode reveals something important about the entire golden age of airship travel that the more polished publicity photographs and glowing newspaper coverage tended to obscure. These were not simple, risk-free pleasure cruises. They were genuinely difficult feats of engineering and seamanship, undertaken by crews who had to be prepared, at any moment, to solve life-threatening problems with whatever tools and courage they happened to have on hand, thousands of feet above an ocean that offered no safe harbor if anything went seriously wrong. It is worth remembering this kind of close call alongside the comfort and luxury that defined the public image of these ships, because both were equally real, and both were part of what made the era remarkable. The same vessel that carried passengers through panoramic windows and served them meals from a proper galley was, in moments like this one, also a fragile structure of aluminum girders and fabric, suspended thousands of feet above water, cold enough to kill within minutes, dependent entirely on the skill and nerve of a crew who had no instruction manual for problems this severe, and had to invent their solutions in real time, with the wind tearing at them and the ocean waiting below. For all the danger that crews like Ekener's had to manage in moments of crisis, the experience offered to paying passengers aboard these ships was, by deliberate design, almost entirely free of that tension. What they were sold, and what they received, was something closer to a floating hotel than a conventional flight. Graf Zeppelin's passenger accommodations reflected this philosophy throughout. Travelers were assigned double cabins rather than mere seats, modest in size but genuinely private, a level of personal space that no airplane of the era, and few ocean liners outside of first class, could offer at comparable speed. The public areas were arranged around panoramic windows that ran along much of the passenger deck, allowing travelers to watch the world pass beneath them from a comfortable lounge rather than craning toward a small porthole. Meals were not packaged or reheated. They were freshly cooked aboard, in an onboard kitchen, and served properly in a dedicated dining area. Weight remained the constant, governing constraint behind every design decision on a passenger airship, and nowhere was this more apparent to travelers than in the luggage allowance. Each passenger was permitted only 50 pounds of personal luggage for an entire transatlantic crossing, a strict limit that reflected just how precisely engineers had to balance every component of the ship, down to the weight of a traveler's spare clothing, against the lifting capacity of the gas cells above them. Hugo Ekener himself captured the particular character of this kind of travel in a phrase he used often when describing the experience to prospective passengers and the press. You don't fly in an airship, you go voyaging. It was a deliberate distinction, and an accurate one. The word voyaging carried connotations of unhurried travel, of a journey to be savoured rather than endured. the language of an ocean crossing rather than a flight in the modern sense. Lady Drummond Hay, a journalist who traveled aboard Graf Zeppelin's inaugural transatlantic flight in 1929, left behind one of the more vivid first-hand accounts of what this experience actually felt like from the inside. She described fellow passengers who could not tear themselves away from the windows, moving from one side of the cabin to the other as the view shifted, exclaiming at each new feature of the landscape or seascape passing below. She was particularly struck by the cabin arrangements themselves, describing the charming sleeping compartments and a luxurious silk-covered settee that, by night, converted into a proper bed, a level of thoughtful comfort that few travelers of any era would expect to find suspended thousands of feet above the open Atlantic. By the time LZ-129, the airship that would become known to history as the Hindenburg, entered service in 1936, this approach to passenger comfort had been refined even further. Hindenburg's dining room offered an elegant setting for meals, considerably more spacious than Graf Zeppelin's had been. The ship carried a specially constructed aluminum piano in its lounge, built deliberately lightweight to satisfy the same weight constraints that governed every other element of the design, allowing passengers to enjoy live music during the crossing in a way that captured, perhaps better than any other single detail, just how far airship designers had pushed the boundary between practical engineering necessity and genuine, considered luxury. One further detail from Hindenburg's interior captures the strange and very real tension running beneath all of this comfort. The ship included a designated smoking room, a single space, carefully sealed and kept under slightly higher air pressure than the rest of the vessel, specifically to prevent any leaked hydrogen from entering and accumulating near an open flame. Passengers wishing to smoke during the multi-day crossing had to do so in this one tightly controlled location, accessed through a double-door airlock system supervised by a steward who handled the only cigarette lighter permitted anywhere aboard the entire ship. It was an arrangement that, viewed from today, reads as almost unbelievably risky, asking passengers to trust an elaborate set of precautions built specifically to manage the danger of the very gas keeping them aloft. At the time, it was simply accepted as one of the necessary compromises of travel aboard the most luxurious flying machine the world had yet produced. This was the experience that Graf Zeppelin and Hindenburg sold to the public throughout the 1930s, an experience genuinely unmatched by anything available before or since, and one that the developing airline industry, focused on speed and volume rather than comfort and spectacle, would never seriously attempt to replicate even decades later, once jet travel made the ocean crossing itself almost an afterthought. But these two passenger ships were not the only large, rigid airships flying during this period. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States Navy had taken the same basic technology and pointed it toward an entirely different and considerably stranger purpose. In the early 1930s, the United States Navy built something that, described plainly, sounds more like a piece of science fiction than a real piece of military hardware that actually flew. An aircraft carrier that was itself an aircraft. USS Akron, designated ZRS-4, was a helium-filled, rigid airship, 785 feet in length, constructed by the Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation at a purpose-built air dock in Akron, Ohio, the city she would be named after. Construction began in late 1929 under the direction of chief designer Karl Arnstein, who led a team that included experienced German airship engineers, brought over specifically to support the project, a continuation of the same engineering lineage that traced back to Ferdinand von Zeppelin's original work decades earlier. The construction cost for Akron alone came to roughly $5.5 million, a substantial sum for 1931, reflecting just how ambitious and technically demanding this particular project actually was. Akron's design departed from traditional Zeppelin engineering in several important ways. Rather than using single-girder ring structures braced with radial wires, the standard approach in German rigid airship construction, Akron's main rings were built as deep, self-supporting triangular trusses, curled into a circular shape. This design was considerably heavier than the conventional approach, but it was also considerably stronger, a deliberate trade-off the Navy insisted on after watching earlier rigid airships break apart in flight under structural stress. The fins at the rear of the ship were mounted entirely externally to the main hull structure, rather than being supported by an internal cruciform framework, simplifying the design and improving visibility from the control car, though this particular choice would later prove more consequential than anyone involved fully anticipated at the time. What made Akron and her eventual sister ship genuinely unprecedented, even among the remarkable airships built during this era, was their function as flying aircraft carriers. Each ship was equipped with an internal hangar bay, roughly 75 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 16 feet high, capable of storing and servicing up to 5 small Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk biplane fighters. These aircraft were launched and recovered, while the airship remained in continuous flight, using a trapeze mechanism lowered through a large T-shaped opening in the bottom of the hull. A Sparrowhawk pilot wishing to land would fly up beneath the airship, match its cruising speed of roughly 70 knots, and engage a hook mounted above the fighter's upper wing onto the lowered trapeze bar. Once securely hooked, the trapeze would haul the entire aircraft up into the hangar bay, where its wings could then be folded for storage alongside the other fighters. This sounds, even now, like something that should not have worked reliably. It did. Trained Sparrowhawk pilots eventually became skilled enough to complete this aerial recovery even in moderately rough air, with the airship pitching and yawing around them as they attempted to thread a small fighter onto a swinging trapeze bar suspended from a vessel the length of 2.5 football fields. Akron entered active naval service in 1931, designed primarily for long-range scouting in support of the fleet, extending the Navy's effective visual range far beyond what any surface ship alone could achieve. Her embarked aircraft tripled the effective area she could patrol on any given mission, since the Sparrowhawks could range out from the airship itself and report back, multiplying her reconnaissance reach considerably. The ship's early career included a notable embarrassment in February 1932, when she broke away from her ground handlers at Lakehurst in front of a group of visiting congressmen and damaged her lower fin against the ground, requiring 2 months of repair before she could resume active operations. Despite this setback, Akron went on to demonstrate genuine operational value across 1932, participating in exercises, undertaking long-distance demonstration flights to showcase the airship to the American public and to government officials, and proving, mission after mission, that the flying aircraft carrier concept Carl Arnstein and his team had designed actually functioned as intended in real operational conditions. By November of that year, with her full squadron of Sparrowhawks finally operational, Akron carried as many as 207 people aboard during one demonstration flight, a figure that included not just her regular crew, but Navy personnel observing the trial, evidence of just how seriously the service had come to take the airship's potential as a working military asset rather than a mere curiosity. Proponents within the Navy argued, with genuine conviction, that the airship's combination of extended range, persistent overhead presence, and onboard fighter protection represented a scouting capability no surface fleet could match, extending the eyes of the Pacific Fleet across a stretch of ocean that would otherwise have remained entirely invisible to American commanders until an enemy vessel was already dangerously close. What none of those early successes could fully prepare her crew for was a single violent night in April 1933, when the same Atlantic weather that had nearly claimed Graf Zeppelin years earlier would prove considerably less forgiving. USS Macon, Akron's sister ship, designated ZRS-5, followed the same basic design but represented the refined second iteration of the Akron-class concept, built with hard-won lessons already learned from her sister's 2 years of active operational service. Macon made her first flight on April 21, 1933, just over 2 weeks after Akron had been lost, a coincidence of timing that placed an unusual weight on the new ship's shoulders from the very beginning of her career. She was commissioned into the Navy on June 23, 1933, under the command of Commander Alger H. Dressel, and was soon transferred to Naval Air Station Moffett Field in California, which became her permanent home base for the remainder of her relatively brief but eventful operational life. Like Akron, Macon carried 12 gas cells filled with helium rather than hydrogen, a deliberate American policy decision that reflected the country's privileged access to the world's primary helium reserves, and which stood in deliberate, careful contrast to the hydrogen-dependent German passenger fleet operating at the same time on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. 8 Maybach engines, each producing 560 horsepower, drove propellers that could be rotated to provide thrust, forward, backward, or downward, an early and genuinely sophisticated form of thrust vectoring that gave Macon's pilots considerably more precise control during delicate takeoff and landing maneuvers than earlier airship designs had ever allowed their crews. Macon proved, across her operational career, to be considerably more productive and more thoroughly tested than her ill-fated sister had managed to be in her brief 2 years of service. Her commanders developed and refined the doctrine for using an airship's onboard aircraft for scouting purposes, while keeping the airship herself out of visual range of an opposing force, a tactical innovation that took real advantage of the Sparrowhawk's range and the airship's own ability to remain aloft and undetected at a safe distance. In a 1934 fleet exercise, aircraft launched from Macon successfully located the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga and maintained continuous surveillance on her for several hours without Saratoga's own crew realizing they were being watched, a genuine and closely studied demonstration of exactly the kind of reconnaissance advantage that had justified the entire flying aircraft carrier program in the first place. Macon also demonstrated a search and rescue capability that proved her practical value beyond pure military reconnaissance. On at least one occasion, her embarked aircraft were able to locate and mark the position of 2 airmen lost at sea, holding station over them and guiding surface rescue vessels to their location until both were safely recovered, a role that no other naval asset of the period could have filled with comparable speed or reach. During the same general period, Macon also participated in a high-profile mission tracking the cruiser USS Houston, which was carrying President Franklin Roosevelt on a vacation voyage to Hawaii, a training exercise that doubled as a quiet demonstration to the country's highest levels of government of exactly what an airship-based scouting capability could offer the fleet under realistic operating conditions. Not every flight went smoothly. During a challenging cross-continental flight in April 1934, Macon encountered severe turbulence near Van Horn, Texas, that caused a structural failure in one of her internal diagonal girders, followed almost immediately by a second girder failure in the same general area of the frame. Her crew, led by Chief Boatswain's mate Robert J. Davis, carried out emergency repairs to the damaged structure while the ship remained in flight, completing the work within roughly half an hour and allowing Macon to finish her journey safely. The incident, while resolved successfully, revealed a structural weakness in precisely the area of the airframe where the externally mounted fins had been attached, the same design simplification that had been adopted to improve visibility from the control car and that Akron had shared as well. That structural vulnerability, identified but not fully addressed, would prove to be more than an inconvenient repair the next time severe weather found the ship unprepared. For now, through the remainder of 1934 and into early 1935, Macon continued her demonstrated record of operational success, flying further, scouting more effectively, and recovering her aircraft more reliably than any airship had managed before her. She had become, by any reasonable measure, the most capable and most thoroughly proven flying aircraft carrier the world had ever built, her crew increasingly confident in handling an airframe that, only a year earlier, had nearly broken apart over the Texas desert. What happened to her in February 1935, returning to her home base after another routine exercise, would end the entire concept permanently for the United States Navy, and it began with damage to the exact same vulnerable structure that had nearly failed her once already, near a small Texas town, the previous spring. The early 1930s claimed 3 of the largest airships ever built, in 3 separate disasters spread across 5 years and 2 continents, and each loss reshaped how the world understood the risks of this remarkable technology. The first came on October 5, 1930, when the British airship R101 crashed in France during her maiden overseas voyage, bound for India as part of an ambitious imperial passenger service Britain hoped to establish across the empire. The crash killed 48 of the 54 people aboard, including senior government officials who had championed the entire British airship program. The loss was devastating enough, both in human terms and in terms of public confidence, that it led directly to Britain abandoning its rigid airship program entirely. It also had consequences well beyond British borders. Germany's Zeppelin company, watching the disaster unfold, began seriously reconsidering the long-term safety implications of continuing to rely on flammable hydrogen for their own passenger fleet, a reconsideration that would eventually shape the design of their next great airship. The second disaster struck the United States Navy on April 4, 1933, when USS Akron, caught in a violent thunderstorm off the coast of New Jersey during a routine mission to calibrate radio direction finding equipment, was driven into the sea. The exact sequence of events remains debated among historians even now, but the most widely accepted explanation involves the ship being caught in a series of severe downdrafts and updrafts during the night. As Akron attempted to climb away from the turbulence, her tail, positioned nearly 800 feet behind her control car, may have pivoted downward into the ocean's surface, even as her bow continued rising, a consequence of misjudging the ship's altitude in darkness over open water, with an altimeter that some investigators believed the crew may not have read correctly under the stress of the moment. The loss of life was severe. Of the 76 people aboard, only 3 survived, 2 enlisted sailors and the ship's executive officer, Herbert Wiley. Among the 73 who died was Rear Admiral William Moffett, the founding figure of American naval aviation and Akron's most prominent and persistent champion within the Navy's command structure. The freezing water of the North Atlantic in early April, combined with the simple fact that Akron's crew had not been issued life jackets, made survival in the aftermath of the crash itself extraordinarily difficult, a deficiency that the Navy would not repeat with her sister ship. The third loss came on February 12, 1935, when USS Macon, returning to her home base at Moffett Field after a routine exercise, was caught in a severe storm off Point Sur on the California coast. The structural weakness, identified the previous year near Van Horn, Texas, the same vulnerable point where the externally mounted fins attached to the main hull failed under the stress of the storm. One of Macon's stabilizing fins tore away, and the resulting damage to her gas cells caused a loss of buoyancy severe enough to force a controlled but unavoidable descent into the ocean below. Here, the lessons learned from Akron's loss 2 years earlier made a genuine and measurable difference. Macon's crew had been issued life jackets and rafts in the aftermath of the Akron disaster, a precaution that proved decisive. Of the 83 people aboard, only 2 died, a survival rate dramatically different from what Akron's crew had faced in the cold Atlantic less than 2 years before. Macon settled into the ocean and sank to a depth that placed her wreck beyond the reach of any diving technology available for decades afterward, her precise location remaining unknown to researchers until well into the late 20th century, when deep-sea survey technology finally advanced enough to locate and document the remains. 3 airships, 3 storms, 3 separate national programs, all converging on broadly the same lesson within a span of less than 5 years. These enormous, slow-moving vessels, magnificent as they were in calm conditions, remained fundamentally vulnerable to the kind of violent, unpredictable weather that no engineering of the era could fully anticipate or survive. Each disaster prompted its own formal inquiry, and each inquiry produced recommendations that the respective navies and governments involved did their genuine best to incorporate into whatever vessels remained in service. But the underlying physics never changed. A rigid airship, regardless of how carefully it was built or how experienced its crew, was an enormous surface area of fabric and gas cells stretched over a comparatively delicate metal frame, asked to fly directly through the same Atlantic and Pacific storm systems that posed a serious threat even to ocean-going ships built from solid steel. The technology had one more catastrophic chapter left to write, and it would prove to be the single one the world remembers most vividly of all, even today. LZ-129 Hindenburg made her first flight on March 4, 1936, the largest airship ever built, longer even than the Akron-class vessels that had previously served the United States Navy. She had been designed from the outset to use helium, the safe, inert gas that had spared American airships from the fate that hydrogen-filled vessels had repeatedly suffered. The design intention was sound. The execution ran directly into a problem no German engineer could solve through clever design alone. The United States remained, in the 1930s, essentially the only nation on Earth with significant helium reserves available in commercially usable quantities. American law restricted the export of helium for reasons that combined genuine strategic caution with growing unease about the political direction of the German government under the Nazi Party, which had come to power in 1933 and had begun using Zeppelin flights for propaganda purposes, displaying swastikas on the airship's fins and using them to broadcast political messaging during flights over German cities. Germany requested helium for Hindenburg. The request was denied. Faced with no alternative if the ship was to fly at all, Zeppelin's engineers made the decision that would define the vessel's fate. They filled Hindenburg with hydrogen instead. For just over a year, Hindenburg operated successfully, carrying passengers across the Atlantic alongside the older Graf Zeppelin, offering the same luxurious experience that had defined commercial airship travel for nearly a decade. The private cabins, the elegant dining room, the carefully controlled smoking room, all of it functioning exactly as intended on crossing after crossing. She had also been pressed into service for propaganda purposes by the German government during this period, touring the country and broadcasting political messages over loudspeakers as she passed above German towns and cities, a use that Hindenburg's own captain, Hugo Eckener, openly disapproved of and resisted where he could, given his long-standing personal opposition to the Nazi regime that had come to control so much of the company he had spent his career building. On May 6, 1937, Hindenburg was completing a transatlantic flight from Frankfurt to Lakehurst, New Jersey, the same naval air station where USS Akron had been based years earlier. As the ship approached her mooring mast for landing, in front of a crowd of spectators and journalists gathered to witness the arrival, the tail section of the airship caught fire. Within seconds, the fire spread through the hull, consuming the hydrogen-filled gas cells and engulfing the entire vessel in flame. 35 of the 97 people aboard died, along with one member of the ground crew working below. It is worth stating plainly, because it runs counter to how the disaster is often remembered through the lens of the dramatic newsreel footage that captured it. 62 of the 97 people aboard survived, a number that reflects both genuine heroism among the crew, several of whom helped passengers escape the burning wreckage even as the fire spread around them, and the simple fact that Hindenburg was already close enough to the ground at the moment the fire began that many aboard had at least some real chance to escape into the open field below. The cause of the fire has never been definitively established. The leading explanation, supported by the bulk of subsequent investigation, holds that static electricity, built up during the ship's final approach, ignited hydrogen that had leaked from the gas cells, possibly through a torn or damaged cell wall. Other theories, including deliberate sabotage, have been proposed over the decades since, but none has produced conclusive evidence sufficient to overturn the static electricity explanation that investigators reached in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. What made the Hindenburg disaster different from the losses of R101, Akron, and Macon was not its scale. All four disasters claimed serious loss of life, and not even its cause, fire and storm damage having both already proven fatal to earlier airships. What made it different was that it happened in full view of news cameras and radio broadcasters who had gathered specifically to cover what was expected to be an entirely routine arrival. The fire was captured on film in real time and broadcast to audiences around the world within days. An image that burned itself into public memory with a permanence that the open ocean losses of Akron and Macon, witnessed by almost no one, could never have achieved regardless of their own severity. The age of the passenger rigid airship effectively ended in those few terrible minutes at Lakehurst. No commercial Zeppelin would ever carry a fare-paying passenger again. But the full picture of the era these vessels represented requires looking past that single dramatic afternoon, back across the 3 preceding decades, to understand just how genuinely safe this remarkable form of travel had actually been before it ended. The image most people carry of airship travel, if they carry one at all, is the Hindenburg burning at Lakehurst. It is a vivid, dramatic, and entirely real image. It is also, on its own, a deeply misleading summary of what passenger airship travel had actually been across the 3 decades that preceded it. In the entire history of commercial Zeppelin passenger service, beginning with Delag's first flights in 1910 and continuing all the way through to the morning of May 6, 1937, tens of thousands of passengers flew well over 1 million miles aboard these vessels, across more than 2,000 individual flights, without a single passenger injury. Not one. This figure encompasses more than a quarter-century of regular, repeated commercial operation, carrying ordinary paying customers across distances and durations that included transatlantic crossings, a circumnavigation of the globe, and routine domestic flights within Germany, all of it accident-free from the passenger's perspective until the final few minutes of Hindenburg's final flight. This record places commercial airship travel among the safest forms of long-distance transportation available anywhere in the world during the same period, a claim that becomes more striking, not less, once the relative newness and genuinely experimental nature of the underlying technology is taken fully into account. Aviation in the 1920s and 1930s more broadly was a genuinely dangerous undertaking. Early airline service by airplane, still finding its footing during these same decades, suffered repeated fatal accidents as the industry worked through the basic engineering and procedural challenges of reliable powered flight. Commercial Zeppelin service, by comparison, had quietly built one of the most consistent safety records of any transportation mode of its era, a fact that the dramatic ending of the Hindenburg has almost entirely erased from popular memory. Hindenburg herself holds a particular distinction worth noting in this context. Her chief steward, responsible for managing the passenger experience throughout each crossing, is generally considered the first flight attendant in the history of commercial aviation, a role created specifically for the unique demands of multi-day airship travel that no airplane crew of the era needed to fill in anything like the same capacity. It is a small detail, but it reflects how genuinely developed and considered the entire passenger experience had become by the time Hindenburg entered service. The product of nearly 30 years of accumulated operational experience, rather than a hastily assembled novelty thrown together for one impressive but fleeting season of travel. It is also worth noting, with appropriate honesty and care, that the passenger airship was already approaching technological obsolescence before the Hindenburg disaster brought its era to a definitive close. 3 months before Hindenburg's first flight, on November 22, 1935, Pan American Airways had completed the first scheduled commercial flight across the Pacific Ocean by airplane using the China Clipper flying boat. Airplane technology was advancing rapidly enough in both range and reliability that the fundamental advantages airships had once held, namely speed and comfort relative to ocean liners, were beginning to erode even before any single dramatic accident intervened. Historians of aviation have long debated how much longer commercial airship service might have continued even without the Hindenburg disaster, given how quickly heavier-than-air technology was closing the gap, and how steeply the cost of operating something the size of a small ocean liner compared against a far smaller, far cheaper airplane carrying a similar number of passengers. What this fuller context suggests is that the end of the rigid airship era resulted from the combination of two separate forces working together rather than a single catastrophic failure alone. The Hindenburg disaster delivered an immediate and devastating blow to public confidence, one no industry could easily survive regardless of its prior safety record. But the airplane was also simply becoming better, faster, and more practical at almost exactly the same moment, narrowing the specific advantages that had justified building these enormous, complex, and expensive vessels in the first place. Both things were true. The disaster was real, and so was the underlying decades of genuine, hard-won safety that preceded it. Holding both of those facts together, rather than letting the more dramatic one entirely overwrite the other, is the fairest way to remember what this technology actually achieved. It is worth remembering, too, that the people who built and flew these vessels across that long, accident-free quarter-century were not lucky amateurs at all. They were careful, methodical engineers and crews who took the genuine dangers of hydrogen and scale seriously every single day, refining their procedures with each flight, and who managed, for nearly 30 years, to make something inherently risky behave, in practice, almost entirely safely. What followed the disaster for the rigid airship as a technology was not a slow decline, but something closer to a complete and sudden silence. In the immediate aftermath of the Hindenburg disaster, Germany resolved, formally and decisively, that any future passenger, Zeppelin, would use only safe, inert helium rather than hydrogen. It was a sound decision, arrived at exactly the way it should have been, too late for the ship that had already burned, but with genuine intent to prevent the same outcome from ever happening again. It made no practical difference at all to the company's actual situation. The United States remained, as it had been throughout the 1920s and 1930s, essentially the only nation on Earth with meaningful helium reserves available for export. In September 1937, the United States Congress passed the Helium Act, a law specifically requiring that any airship flying to or from the United States use helium rather than hydrogen. On paper, this looked like exactly the kind of regulatory safeguard the disaster should have produced. In practice, it solved nothing for Germany, which still could not obtain American helium in any meaningful quantity, regardless of what the law required, since the underlying export restrictions that had doomed Hindenburg in the first place remained firmly in place. Without access to helium, and with public confidence in hydrogen-filled passenger airships destroyed beyond any realistic recovery, Luftschiffbau Zeppelin found itself with no viable path forward. The company was compelled to terminate Zeppelin manufacturing entirely in 1938, bringing to a close a production line that traced its lineage directly back to Ferdinand von Zeppelin's first imperfect flight over Lake Constance in 1900. What happened to the surviving great airships themselves captures the finality of this ending with unusual precision. The frames of Graf Zeppelin, the pioneering vessel that had circled the entire globe less than a decade earlier, and her newer sister ship, Graf Zeppelin II, along with whatever scrap material remained salvageable from Hindenburg's own burned wreckage, were all dismantled that same year 1938. Their valuable aluminum alloy components were not preserved or memorialized. They were melted down and repurposed to help meet the German military's growing demand for heavier-than-air combat aircraft, as the country moved steadily toward the war that would begin the following year. The machines that had once carried passengers across oceans in private cabins, serving fresh meals beneath panoramic windows, were converted, quite literally, into raw material for the warplanes of an entirely different and far more destructive era of aviation. A single, smaller successor, designated LZ-130, had been constructed before the final shutdown and was used briefly for limited military surveillance purposes, despite the country's own declared prohibition on hydrogen, a contradiction made necessary simply because the promised American-German helium agreement that might have allowed her to fly safely had collapsed entirely amid the steadily deteriorating political relationship between the two nations. Even this final vessel saw only limited use before the rigid airship program was abandoned altogether. Across the Atlantic, the United States Navy reached a parallel conclusion through its own separate chain of reasoning. The losses of Akron and Macon, just over 2 years apart, had already raised serious questions within the Navy's own leadership about whether the rigid airship's demonstrated vulnerabilities outweighed its genuine operational advantages. By 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt's administration had concluded officially that further investment in rigid airships was not justified, noting that the scouting missions these vessels had once promised to perform more effectively could now be accomplished at considerably lower cost and lower risk, using long-range flying boats instead. The combined effect of these decisions, made independently in Germany and the United States, within roughly the same narrow window of time, was total. The rigid airship, as a working, operational technology, carrying either passengers or military payloads, effectively disappeared from active service for the remainder of the 20th century. The hangars built specifically to house these enormous vessels stood empty or were repurposed for other uses. The engineers who had spent entire careers mastering the particular challenges of buoyant flight at scale moved on to other work, much of it absorbed into the rapidly expanding heavier-than-air aviation industry that had, in the end, simply outpaced them. For more than 50 years, the great sky giants that had once drawn crowds out into the streets to watch their shadows pass overhead were gone entirely from the world's skies, remembered mostly through old newsreel footage and the particular, dramatic image of a single ship in flames at Lakehurst. But the underlying idea, buoyant lift, quiet flight, and a genuinely different way of moving through the sky, had not actually died. It had simply gone quiet, waiting for circumstances and engineering to catch up with it once again, in a future that none of the engineers dismantling Graf Zeppelin's frame in 1938 could possibly have imagined, decades away, on the other side of an ocean and a war that had not yet even begun. Before moving toward the resurgence this story is building toward, it is worth pausing to appreciate what made these vessels genuinely remarkable as feats of engineering. Entirely apart from how their era eventually ended, the structural philosophy behind the rigid airship represented a sophisticated and, for its time, genuinely advanced approach to a difficult problem. Rather than relying on internal gas pressure to hold a vessel's shape, the way a simple balloon or a modern advertising blimp does, rigid airships were built around a true structural skeleton, typically made from lightweight aluminum alloy girders arranged into rings and longitudinal beams running the full length of the hull. This frame carried every meaningful structural load the vessel encountered. The fabric skin stretched over the outside of that frame contributed essentially nothing to the ship's structural strength. Its job was purely aerodynamic, smoothing the airflow over the hull's surface and shielding the internal structure and gas cells from wind and weather. This separation of structural and aerodynamic function, the frame doing the holding, the skin doing the smoothing, was a genuinely sophisticated piece of engineering thinking that would not become a common, deliberate design principle in heavier-than-air aircraft construction for several more decades. Modern airplane fuselages, with their internal structural frames and separate non-load-bearing outer skins, owe a conceptual debt to exactly this kind of thinking, even though the specific engineers who eventually applied it to airplane design were not necessarily drawing direct inspiration from airships at all. The management of buoyancy itself, moment to moment throughout a flight, demanded a level of continuous attention and skill that modern travelers, accustomed to airplanes that simply take off and land, rarely have cause to appreciate. As fuel burned off during a long flight, an airship grew steadily lighter, and that lightness had to be managed deliberately, either by venting a small amount of lifting gas or by carefully adjusting ballast to keep the vessel flying at its intended altitude rather than climbing uncontrollably as it lost weight. Skilled crews developed an almost intuitive feel for this balance, conserving both their gas and their ballast as carefully as possible across a multi-day crossing, since either resource, once spent, could not be replenished until the ship reached land again. Few details capture the elegance of this engineering challenge better than Blau gas, the specially formulated fuel burned by Graf Zeppelin's engines on many of her longest flights. Conventional liquid aviation fuel grows lighter as it burns, steadily reducing an aircraft's overall weight in a way that, for an airship, would constantly upset the careful buoyancy balance its crew worked to maintain. Blau gas was deliberately formulated to weigh nearly the same as the surrounding air, so that consuming it for propulsion had only a minimal effect on the ship's overall lift, allowing for a far steadier, far more predictable long-range flight than conventional fuel would ever have permitted. It is difficult to think of another form of transportation before or since that required engineers to solve a problem quite this specific, or that solved it with quite this much elegance. The sheer ratio of scale to crew size achieved by the largest of these vessels also deserves real recognition. Hindenburg, at 804 feet in length and carrying up to 97 people across an ocean, required a flight crew of roughly 40 to 60, depending on the specific voyage, a remarkably small number of people responsible for managing a structure that dwarfed almost anything else that had ever flown. Modern cruise ships of comparable passenger capacity require crews many times larger. The efficiency this reflects, the product of 3 decades of accumulated operational refinement, represented genuine mastery of an extraordinarily complex flying machine. None of this engineering brilliance prevented the disasters that ultimately ended the era. Hydrogen's flammability, the structural vulnerability these enormous fabric and metal vessels carried when exposed to severe weather, and the simple economic and practical advantages that heavier-than-air aircraft would go on to develop, were fundamental limitations that no amount of clever design could fully resolve. But genuine engineering excellence and eventual technological obsolescence are not contradictory facts. Both were true of the rigid airship simultaneously, and the brilliance deserves to be remembered on its own terms rather than erased entirely by how the story ultimately ended. The engineers who solved the Blau gas problem, who worked out how to separate structural and aerodynamic function decades before that became standard practice, who built a frame strong enough to carry nearly 100 people safely across an ocean using a crew smaller than that of a modern hotel, were doing genuinely original work under real pressure, with no established playbook to follow, and the results they achieved across 3 decades of continuous refinement deserve to be measured against the standards of their own era, rather than judged unfairly by the standards of ours. That brilliance, it turns out, never disappeared completely. It was simply waiting for a quieter, more patient moment to return. The rigid airship did not stay gone forever. It came back slowly, decades later, in a form considerably smaller and considerably quieter than the great vessels that had once crossed the Atlantic. But it came back nonetheless, carrying the same basic idea that Ferdinand von Zeppelin had first written in his diary in 1874. Since the 1990s, Luftschiffbau Zeppelin GmbH, the modern successor to the company the Count himself founded, has produced a class of airships known as the Zeppelin NT, short for Neue Technologie, or New Technology. These vessels are semi-rigid in design rather than fully rigid, smaller in scale than anything from the Golden Age, and filled exclusively with safe, inert helium, eliminating entirely the kind of risk that had once made hydrogen the technology's defining vulnerability. 7 of these aircraft have been built to date. They are used primarily for sightseeing flights, scientific observation, and aerial photography and reporting, applications that play directly to an airship's genuine strengths, namely quiet, slow, stable flight, rather than speed or heavy passenger capacity. The Zeppelin NT's flight characteristics reflect exactly what made the original Golden Age vessels so beloved by the passengers who experienced them. These modern airships can remain aloft for flight durations of up to 24 hours, and their quiet, vibration-free operation makes them genuinely well-suited to purposes that demand a stable, unhurried aerial platform. Precisely the qualities that drew journalists like Lady Drummond Hay to describe her own 1929 crossing in such vivid, almost reverent terms. Tourists today can book scenic flights over cities including Munich, taking in views of the surrounding countryside from exactly the same kind of slow, panoramic vantage point that once captivated passengers nearly a century earlier. A more significant milestone arrived more recently still. In October 2024, an American company called LTA Research conducted the first test flight of an aircraft named Pathfinder 1 at Moffett Field in California, the very same airfield that had once served as the home base for USS Macon during the height of the Navy's flying aircraft carrier program. Pathfinder 1 is, notably, a fully rigid airship, the first genuinely new, fully rigid design built anywhere in the world in generations, representing a more direct technical continuation of the original Zeppelin engineering tradition than the semi-rigid Zeppelin NT vessels currently operating in Europe. That same month, Pathfinder 1 flew over San Francisco, drawing the kind of curious, upturned faces from people on the street below that would have been entirely familiar to anyone who had watched Graf Zeppelin or Hindenburg pass overhead in the 1930s. Beyond tourism and historical curiosity, modern engineers and companies are exploring genuinely practical new applications for airship technology that go well beyond what the Golden Age vessels ever attempted. Because airships do not require a conventional runway and can be lowered and tethered without ever fully touching the ground, they hold particular promise for delivering cargo and disaster relief supplies to remote areas where building or maintaining an airstrip would be impractical or impossible. Several companies have proposed and begun developing large cargo-carrying airships specifically for this purpose, aiming to combine the lifting capacity that made the original giants so remarkable with the safety of modern materials and the inert reliability of helium. Long-duration scientific monitoring represents another genuinely promising application, one that draws directly on the same fundamental advantage that made Graf Zeppelin's Arctic research expedition possible nearly a century ago. An aircraft that can remain aloft for extended periods, moving slowly and quietly enough to gather detailed observational data without the fuel demands and noise that a conventional airplane would impose on a comparable mission. None of these modern vessels approach the scale of the great vessels this story has spent so much time with tonight. Pathfinder 1, the largest of the new generation, is considerably smaller than Hindenburg ever was, and no one currently building airships is attempting to recreate the enormous transatlantic passenger giants of the 1930s. But the underlying principle, the simple, elegant physics of buoyant lift that Archimedes first described more than 2,000 years ago, has never stopped working, and the patient, unhurried experience of floating silently through open sky has never stopped being something worth pursuing, even after the era that first proved it possible came to its dramatic and unexpected end. The sky, it turns out, was never finished with these machines. It had simply been waiting, quietly, for them to come back, the same way it had waited, patiently, every single time across this long story, for an idea written in a private diary, or a hull rebuilt with chewing gum, or a structure dismantled for scrap, to eventually find its way back into the air once again. That pattern of patient return after apparent ending is, in its own way, the truest thread running through this entire 2-century-long story, and it brings tonight's journey to one final image, the same one this story opened with, seen now with everything that came before it fully understood. A shadow longer than 2 football fields once moved across a city street in complete silence, taking a full minute to pass overhead. You know now exactly what cast it, and exactly how it managed to stay in the air without that silence ever being broken by the engines doing the holding. It began with Archimedes, more than 2,000 years before any of this story's giants existed, working out the simple, elegant principle that a fluid displaced by an object pushes back against it with equal force. The same idea that floats a boat, and that, applied to air instead of water, would eventually float something 800 feet long. It began with Henri Giffard's 3 modest horsepower in 1852, and with Renard and Krebs proving in 1884 that a controlled round trip was possible at all. It began, more specifically than any of that, with a young military officer watching Union Army balloons rise over an American battlefield in 1863, and with the diary entry he wrote 11 years later, on a March night in 1874, describing a rigid frame and separate gas bags that no one else alive had quite managed to put into words in the same way. It moved through Ferdinand von Zeppelin's imperfect 18-minute flight over Lake Constance in 1900, through Delag, carrying 34,000 passengers before any airplane had carried its first paying customer, through wartime bombers and the L-55's doomed record-setting climb, through R-34's chewing gum repair and her stowaway cat crossing an ocean uninvited. It moved through LZ-126's quiet reparations flight and Hugo Eckener's careful stewardship of a company and an idea that for a long stretch of the 1920s seemed perpetually on the edge of folding entirely. It circled the globe with Graf Zeppelin and an unlikely gorilla named Susie, survived a torn fin over the Atlantic, through the nerve of a crew willing to climb out into the wind and repair it mid-flight, and offered passengers an experience of silk-covered settees and panoramic windows that Lady Drummond Hay still found the right words for. Even now, nearly a century later, it built 2 genuine flying aircraft carriers, Akron and Macon, that launched and recovered fighter planes from trapezes hung beneath vessels the length of 2.5 football fields, an idea so strange it sounds invented even when every detail of it is true. It lost 3 of its finest vessels within 5 years, to storms no engineering of the era could fully outrun, and it lost 1 more, the largest of them all, to a fire at Lakehurst that the entire world watched happen in real time, even as 30 years of perfect passenger safety stood quietly, almost forgotten, behind that single burning afternoon. Each of those losses mattered, and each one is remembered tonight, not as a sequence of disasters to dwell on, but as the honest cost of a generation of people who believed, with good reason, that floating quietly through open sky was worth the genuine risk involved in proving it. It went silent for more than 50 years. The frames were melted down, the hangars stood empty. The engineers who had mastered this particular and peculiar kind of flight moved on to other work, and an entire generation grew up never once seeing a shadow like the one this story opened with pass overhead at all. Children who might have once run down a sidewalk chasing a silver whale across the sky, the way one boy did in St. Louis in 1933, grew up instead with only photographs and old newsreel footage to explain what that experience had actually felt like. And then, quietly, Without fanfare, it came back. A Zeppelin NT carrying tourists over Munich on a calm afternoon. A fully rigid airship named Pathfinder 1, lifting off from the same airfield that once launched USS Macon, drawing the same upturned faces on a San Francisco street in 2024 that Belfast, Berlin, and New York once turned skyward in the 1920s and 1930s. The idea that one persistent count wrote down in a private diary a century and a half ago is, right now, tonight, somewhere above the earth, still proving itself true. If tonight's long, slow journey through the forgotten age of the sky giants has carried you somewhere calm and quiet enough to rest, that is exactly what this channel is here for. There are more forgotten giants out there, more patient, true stories waiting to be told, slowly enough to let the night do its work around you. Come back whenever you need somewhere peaceful to land. The shadow is gone from the street now, but somewhere, very quietly, very high above, something lighter than air is still, even tonight, finding its way home, exactly the way it always has, for a century and a half and counting.